In unit number 8, we will take a bird's eye view of the subject of consequentialism, that is utilitarianism, and look at some of the major issues and theories and issues involved. We begin by observing where we're going in this particular video and lecture. We're going to talk about normative ethics and how consequentialism fits in. We're going to look at a number of key contributors to the development of the theory of consequentialism and utilitarian ethics, with a particular focus on Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Then we'll turn our attention to utilitarianism proper, beginning with a brief review of rule utilitarianism, and then looking at some of the important aspects that help us understand some of the issues concerning the usefulness and questions about the value of and the functioning of utilitarianism, its value theory, the happiness principle, and then its theory of right actions, maximizing the benefit of those actions. And looking at how you define happiness and well-being, and asking who are the subjects, who is involved in this community of morality to which we are applying these principles. And then we'll have a brief look at how we define justice in terms of utilitarianism. And we'll sum up with some observations about the attractions of utilitarianism and the challenges to utilitarianism. So that's where we're going. You'll notice that while this lecture will cover many of the same issues covered in the textbook by Russ Schaefer-Liddell, The Ethical Life, I'm approaching this somewhat differently. And there'll be a number of things in this lecture that are quite different from the textbook. And of course, both the textbook and this lecture are going to be examinable. So let's turn our attention to what's in a name. Normative moral theories. These are moral theories, as we reflected earlier in this course, which establish theories about the justification for moral actions. They establish standards for making right and wrong choices. And there are three main theories involved: deontological ethics, virtue ethics, and consequentialism. Now, there's interesting observations that we should make at the beginning. First, Schaefer-Liddell has given us a very useful definition of consequentialism as distinct from utilitarianism. He says, acts are morally right just because they maximize the amount of goodness in the world. Now, I think it's a very useful definition for us to begin this discussion, but we really do need to take into account some qualifications. And we get those, I would suggest, I've taken them deliberately from a standard you can examine from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Sid Armstrong points out this: whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences of that act. And that really is an important aspect of consequentialism, and hence utilitarianism. An act is morally right depends only on the consequences of the act. And of course, something that go on with other qualifications, something that's related to that act, and such as the motive behind the act or the general rule requiring acts of that kind. That applies to rule utilitarianism. The point that we need to make here is that consequentialism is a broad category that covers all the family of views known as utilitarianism. And at the heart of all of them is the view that it defines what is fundamentally morally right, morally wrong. What is a moral duty? If it's morally right, it's a moral duty. If it's morally wrong, it's morally prohibited. It is a moral evil. And that becomes a very significant basis for the development of a moral theory particularly when it comes to society. If something is morally justified, then it's a duty which needs to be implemented. It's what was the kind of argument used by people like John Stuart Mill to drive home arguments about social reform and change. If what we perceive using the principles of utilitarianism, the greater good, the more improved, the greater goodness in the world, the reduction of suffering in the world, that it becomes a moral duty to implement that. A driving force. It's a very significant argument. It'll become clearer when we look at all the various theories and come home. But the bottom line is, as you see, Sigmund Armstrong's first clause is, whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences of that act. And that's really quite significant. All right, let's look at some of the major contributors. Let's dash back to our friend Epicurus. Yes, he's part of the hedonist movement, and we looked at him at that regard. But we also observed when we were discussing him earlier that he was not simply a hedonist, that life is all about pleasure. It was important for him to recognize that pleasure, or the good life, was more a state of tranquility and of freedom, where you are free from fear and from pain, and you achieve this by knowing the world. And his distinction became the absence of pain. And it is that absence of pain which in a sense picked up by Jeremy Bentham. You see this little card picture on the right-hand side of the screen. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And that becomes a kind of battle cry for who's going to be included in the community of morality. Who are people who have moral rights and for whom we have moral duties? If they can suffer, then it's our duty to reduce their suffering, because it's responsible to reduce the suffering in the world. But how do we get there with Bentham? Well, interesting life. He lived in the very difficult and challenging times of the Industrial Revolution. He was very much part of the reform movement in the UK. He was a brilliant student, went to Queen's College, Oxford. He studied law at Lincoln's Inn. He never practiced law. But he really was devoted to legal reform. And it's really his association with our movers and shakers that enabled him to have impact, and association with John Stuart Mill's father, that together they were prominent driving forces behind the reform movement in the United Kingdom. As with all the major players, we look with the value theory first. We look to their value theory first. And happiness, according to Bentham, is a matter of experiencing pleasure and not experiencing pain. And hence he talks about intrinsic goods and bads. And there's only one intrinsic good, and that's pleasure, and one intrinsic bad, that's pain. And he expresses the view that this is common for all mankind. So he comes up with a value theory of the good life, which is common to all men, which is universal. And he begins his ethical discussions out of that principle. The good life is a lack of pain and a life of maximizing pleasure. His ethical theory becomes that you evaluate right and wrong actions on the basis of the consequence of the actions. What's the consequence? The overall happiness created by the action. And this, Jeremy Bentham calls the principle of utility. I've given you the full quote here in the text. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. And it goes on from there. And by the way, this is a term that he derived from David Hume, but it becomes particularly used in ethics by Jeremy Bentham and becomes a key principle, the principle of unity, in the whole discussion of utilitarianism. Now, there's a profound implication we shouldn't miss, and that is that an action that does not maximize happiness is an action which is morally wrong. Now, that's profound. It's not an action that did something wrong, it just doesn't produce something, therefore it's wrong. And this is really quite a significant assertion. We will leave that hanging for the moment, but it's really quite significant. The question that confronted Bentham and confronts all utilitarians is there a motive for everyone to take into account the general happiness of other people? In other words, when we're making our decisions, is there any motive in us going beyond our own personal happiness? If the intrinsic good of our life is being happy and making ourselves happy and avoiding pain, why worry about other people? Well, Bentham, William Sweet suggests, is that we go back to the rational human being argument, that it's rational for us to seek the general happiness of the community because in the interests of everybody, all our interests are intricately bound up together. And it's only rational to recognise that. I've given you the quote from Sweet's work. And so we come to a conclusion, perhaps as a conclusion of challenge. How do you define and qualify pleasure and pain in this context? Well, Bentham wanted to distinguish between intellectual pleasures and simple pleasures. And he didn't want to say that intellectual pleasures were better, but he has an interesting argument. He says intellectual pleasures are good because they lead you to a better life in the long run. Reading a book on philosophy is better than merely playing video games. On the whole trajectory of your life becomes happy if you focus on intellectual pleasures. Well, John Stuart Mill became very much Bentham and his father's successor. John Stuart Mill's father and Bentham were friends, and John Stuart's father was determined that John would become, if you like, the shining light of the movement of reform and egalitarianism and utilitarianism. And he drove John's education. To read the biography of John Stuart Mill is to read a young man who was driven by his father at every turn. Not that there was a breakdown in relationship between them, but his father really had a very firm educational program for his son. And between his father and Bentham, John Stuart Mill was introduced to major players in the reform movement in Britain. Bentham was in fact John Stuart Mill's godfather. However, his life was interesting, and a couple of interesting facts about it. One that should be observed particularly today is for almost 20 years, Harriet Taylor assisted him. And it's often been asked today, as people work through the papers, documents and publication of Mill, to what extent the hand of Harriet Taylor is to be seen in all her work. She was his right-hand source of inspiration and encouragement. On the other hand, it was a very sad relationship because Harriet Taylor was, in fact, married to Mr. Taylor, and it was a very unhappy relationship between Harriet and her husband. And she carried on what was described euphemistically as a platonic ongoing relationship for 20 years with Mill. And when her husband died in 1851, she married Mill, and their marriage lasted 7 years, a very happy one. And indeed, he went into a state of great depression upon her death. But it's an interesting story of the sad life. Well, let's move to his value theory. Again, we'll see the parallels between Mill and Bentham. Happiness is the sole end of human action, and the promotion of it the test by which we to judge all human conduct. Now, what's interesting is the next assertion about happiness and unhappiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. So that's what happiness is, the absence of pain. But unhappiness is defined in terms of pain and the privation of pleasure, which brings into the language of utilitarianism misery. That unhappiness is misery, and that unhappiness is a moral evil, and that privation and misery are moral evils. And again, these values are to all people. Everyone is geared to living a life seeking happiness and absence of pain. Everyone understands unhappiness as pain and privation and misery. And we are all justified in designing our lives around these two intrinsically moral goods and bad. Let's come to his ethics. How does he build this out into an ethical theory? Well, again, he uses the principle of utility, and he basically expresses it in similar terms. But you'll notice that he brings into his discussion this happiness is intended pleasure and absence of pain, and unhappiness is pain and the privation of pleasure. He is expanding a conception of pain and moral evil to be particularly socially applicable. Now, unlike Bentham, in calculating and assessing happiness and pleasure, he wants to distinguish between quality and quantity. If you're talking about misery of life and privation as important aspects of unhappiness, then quite clearly you're talking about qualitative characteristics, and he wants to emphasize that. It's a very difficult passage I've quoted for you to interpolate, but bottom line is it says that we should take into account both quality and quantity when we're dealing with pleasure and pain. Now, again, he begins to develop a concept of justice. If it's true that everyone suffers from pain and misery, and everyone values happiness, it's true that we're all equal in this struggle for happiness and avoiding pain, and we all have the right to maximize our happiness and to minimize our misery. And it is that latter which lays the foundation for an approach to developing social justice, or the morality of social justice. Now, there's one more contributor that we should note, and that's G.E. Moore. This is a 20th century British philosopher from Cambridge. He brings to the fore a slightly different twist, which comes up in some discussions. He wants to assert that what is good is not a thing, but rather a quality. It is not a noun, but an adjective and adverb, an adjective. It qualifies the thing to which it is speaking. In other words, it's completely independent of other things, but it adds to other things. And the consequence is that, unlike other utilitarians who insist there's only one intrinsic value, good, one intrinsic bad, evil, he wants to insist that there are many different kinds of objects that can have intrinsic value to them. And his particular context here is personal relationships and aesthetic enjoyment. And the result of this means that in his theory, it's possible to see more than one thing as being the intrinsic good. And also, and using Moore's words again, he brings into the language of utilitarianism that acts are morally right just because they maximize the amount of goodness in the world. In other words, goodness can attach to things in the world and increase the world's experience of it. I'll leave you to look at Singer's view on animal rights, and we'll see something a little later on. I don't want to get off on that issue at this point in time. So let's turn our attention now to an overview of utilitarianism. Two primary rules here. We'll look at rule utilitarianism in more detail in a moment. Again, you'll see that I've taken Ladau's basic definition. And a key thing to note here is the concept of optimific social rule. It's a rule that yields the greatest balance of benefits over drawbacks. And the important thing to notice about this optimific social rule is it's one you create. It's not unsimilar to the approach taken by Kant when he asks us to come up with our understanding of the categorical imperative. So, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And likewise, I've taken the act utilitarian definition given by Ladau, again to keep things simple for the purpose of this course. An action is morally required because it improves well-being more than any other action. So the contrast here is it's morally right because it's required by an optimific social rule utilitarianism, or it's morally right because it involves more well-being than any other action it would take. So let's turn our attention now to rule utilitarianism. Probably the latest and most powerful presentation of rule utilitarianism is that given by Brad Hooker. Unlike Ladau, I would suggest that Brad Hooker's arguments have carried a lot more weight than he gives them credit for. Not because I'm agreeing, but because simply he has had a very substantial following. He published his work in 2000, Ideal Code, Real World, and he gives this important definition. He says, according to rule consequentialism, acts should be assessed morally in terms of impartially justified rules. And rules are impartially justified, not because there's no connection to the world, but because you do the following things. Rules are impartially justified if and only if the expected overall value of the general internalization of that rule is at least as great as any alternative rule or rules. We'll make some sense of that now by working through. Before we do that, let's observe that he includes as intrinsic goods both happiness and justice. And he's doing that to avoid some of the problems that come up in utilitarianism when some of the rules utilitarians provide end up guiding us in a direction of or what J.J. Smart will later call irrational rule worship. And J.J. Smart does not give him enough credit for the role of justice in his Brad Hooker's thinking. But enough of that. The bottom line is that optimistic social rules produce the greatest happiness and respect for justice. There's not just justice, respect for justice. So, let's go through the procedure that he is suggesting. First, you define the rule. You'll base that on general moral principles. You assess the overall value or well-being to society of the rule being applied. You do that internally. And you establish that is your rule to be applied. So you're creating the rule. Now the concern is, could you create two rules that essentially conflict? So let's take a couple of illustrations and ask the question. Take this rule, for example. Do not incarcerate captured terrorists without a just and fair trial. That's one rule. It sounds very good. Seems to meet the standards of respect for justice and seem to be the happiness of the community as a whole as benefit, as well as the happiness of the terrorist. It seems to be a fair and just rule. Another rule could be use torture on captured terrorists to elicit information about an explosive device you have reason to believe has been planted by those terrorists and is timed to explode immediately and will kill large numbers of innocent bystanders. Now this is a challenging rule. For example, in the second part of the textbook, The Ethical Life, you have Walzer giving an article on terrorism, and you have the important article by Alan Dershowitz, Should the Ticking Bomb Terrorists be Tortured? The kind of argument that's debated there is that it's a benefit to society. Well, Brad Hooker has proposed the question, is it promoting respect for justice? Well, that's debatable. And there's a sense in which this second rule, use torture on captured terrorists, might in fact be a real challenge for justice. But part of the reason might be that justice is inherently impacted, or our view of justice, or what respect for justice means in our minds, is that torture is inherently bad. I didn't say intrinsically bad, I said inherently bad. So perhaps there's some sting to J.J. Smart's criticism of rule utilitarianism. This is an old critique of rule utilitarianism, from 1956, where he says that you can produce rules that are extremely irrational, and insist in following rules that even when you see that breaking the rule produces a greater benefit. Because once you have a rule, you're bound by it. So it's a kind of deontological rule utilitarianism he is arguing. I don't think he's fair to Brad Hooker, but he wasn't writing in relation to Brad Hooker. But I think it's an interesting concept that Brad Hooker has, and a bit of a powerful discussion. Well, let's turn our attention briefly to act utilitarianism, and then we'll look at the important questions that follow. Again, I've simply given you here again the Tao's definition: an action is morally required because it improves well-being more than any other action. Contrast with rule utilitarianism: an action is morally justified when it complies with a rule. Here, we come into contact with a number of issues to be considered. It's very clear that in this understanding of act utilitarianism, there are two fundamental areas. First is the value being expressed, well-being. And the second is the way you make the right action choices, producing, on balance, the greatest happiness. So, important issue, let's look at the value theory, let's look at the way you make right actions. And then we'll specifically look at the problems of qualifying and evaluating the meanings of happiness and what it is. A very difficult area. We'll then look at who are the subjects of the moral community, membership of which is the principle of happiness. And then how do we define justice and its moral status? So let's look at those 5 things. The value theory. Happiness is a universally shared value. Pain is a universally shared experience. This theory is clearly universal. Every human being experiences pain, enjoys happiness. It's obviously universal. And it's very simple. It may be a problem to define, but it's a very simple idea. It's egalitarian, at least in some senses, that everyone experiences pain, everyone wants happiness. It meets the principle of agent neutrality. No one's interest counts more than anyone else's, in other words. And it's frankly intuitive. I mean, you can't help but come to that conclusion. But the big question here is happiness the only intrinsic value? For example, it's possible for people to consider themselves happy in ways which are not really universal. For example, you can have people who are perfectly happy but living a delusion. And it's not a universal principle that we live a delusion. It's similar, whereas we have diminished states or diminished people. We have people who don't experience happiness in anywhere near the same qualitative way that the rest of the world does. So someone suggested change from the concept of happiness to the concept of well-being and focus more on the community's well-being than the specific individual. John Stuart Mill suggested we distinguish between the quality of happiness or pleasure and the quantity of happiness. And it's very important to consider both aspects to know when something is happy. Bentham, of course, as we mentioned earlier, distinguished between intellectual and simple pleasures. But here's the point. Is perhaps happiness too broad and vague a category to be established as the moral theory and to establish a single intrinsic moral value? And it's perhaps for the confusions that are here that some, like Moore and others, have been raising the question of including justice as an aspect of intrinsic value or another intrinsic value. All right, I haven't much to add to that. The textbook has a discussion of this. The bottom line is it's very difficult to define. We move on to the value itself, which is, in a sense, intuitable, understandable, and at least even with those fringe areas of delusion and diminished beings, still possible to argue it's a very universal and inherently, intrinsically good idea. We need to first, before we talk about maximizing value, or the theories of, or the practice of the rules for maximizing value, to clarify 2 misunderstandings. Very often people refer to utilitarianism simply in terms of whatever benefits the greatest number of people. And there are cases where that has been used and explained as being the principle of utilitarianism. And indeed it's partly true, but it's only partly true. And a second misunderstanding is to the idea you choose actions to create the greatest amount of happiness. what is not the greatest amount of happiness. The key issue in particularly modern day utilitarianism is the performance of an act that creates the greatest net balance of happiness over unhappiness. It's a balancing. Which of course immediately raises the question of how you work that out, how you evaluate that. And perhaps the best way to illustrate that is to look at some examples. First, let's turn to T.M. Scanlon's example. He's an emeritus professor at Harvard. This is his illustration. I found it very helpful. Joe is a television technician, and he's working primarily in the primary broadcast booth for television at the final of the World Cup football match. Now, there's a privilege. Now, if you know about football, you know that millions watch football matches. It's a hugely followed big deal. I think it was 2006, 5 billion people watching the final of the World Cup. Anyway, billions do. I'm picking the figure 5 billion. And suddenly, in the midst of the cup final, a large piece of equipment falls over and pins Joe's leg. He's in the primary broadcast booth. That's where it all comes from. And Joe is in excruciating pain. But it will be necessary to interrupt the World Cup's transmission to relieve his pain, to lift the equipment off him and free him. And if they do that, that'll cause a loss of well-being and happiness for 5 billion people, and that for 10 minutes. Now, how would a consequentialist approach this? Well, it is intrinsically morally right to relieve Joe's pain. It's a duty to relieve pain. It not only reduce his pain, but as one person in the world less suffering pain, the world will be having less suffering and pain. Therefore, it is a moral duty to interrupt the program. But this may not be the whole story for consequentialists. We'll see about that in a moment. Let's go on to example number 2. The limited resources in the emergency room. Challenge. Bill arrives at an isolated emergency room with a severe migraine headache, and he needs a special painkiller for excruciating pain. However, at the same time, Philip and Mary arrive, each with multiple limb injuries caused by a car accident, and they're both in excruciating pain. Now, here's the problem. This poor isolated emergency room has only 2 doses of this special painkiller, and restocking is not possible in a few days. How do you work out which 2 patients get the painkiller? It's very difficult. Simply using maximizing and minimizing well-being. You have a duty to minimize, but how do you choose between them? 3 people, 2 doses. Maximizing value is a challenge. Now let's go back to our example number 1. When large numbers of people are involved in the process of evaluating the maximizing of well-being and the minimizing of pain and suffering and misery, you have millions involved. It's very challenging because you have a situation where a very tiny bit of suffering across millions of people outweighs the suffering of one individual, even if it's an excruciating level. Let's follow that through. Followers of the World Cup final are passionate people. They feel deeply about every aspect, moment of the game. To break a television transmission to 5 billion people for 10 minutes would cause an increase in suffering for them and the world. Reduce the well-being of the world. You have a moral duty to stop that. So here's the rub. To reduce Joe's suffering by cutting TV coverage for 10 minutes, which is a moral duty, his suffering could seem to be quite insignificant when compared to the suffering in the world that would arise from 5 billion people suffering the cutting of their TV for 10 minutes. So the conclusion could be that we just leave Joe suffering so that 5 people can continue enjoying and maximising their well-being watching uninterrupted coverage of the World Cup. Well, all we're doing here is seeing the problem of, first and foremost, the value theory, the challenges to it, and the challenges to maximising value and calculating it. So that brings us now on to another aspect of maximising the value. In a sense, it's a response to it. Consequentialism is a standard for evaluating making moral decisions. It's not a procedure for giving you a guide to life. And this is insisted by consequentialists. Although it would be exhausting to exercise a consequentialist decision at every step in life, of course you can describe every step in life as being a goal. But if consequentialism is merely a standard for evaluating that makes actions morally right or wrong, and not a procedure for providing guidance, we're left with an enormous question. How does utilitarianism gain guidance? If you're a utilitarian, how do you really gain guidance in maximising value? One of the arguments used by some utilitarians suggests when you think of life as a journey, along this journey you have various points or goals, in between which you take many other little actions. It's a journey. At these particular goals, A, B and C, you're going to maximise value. So you have your moral goals set ahead of you, and between you and the goal, and between that goal and the next goal, you understand that there are moral signposts. And what are these moral signposts? Well, these utilitarians would say that there are certain accepted moral signposts, such as do not kill, respect a person's autonomy, do not treat people as a means to an end, and so on. You can add your list in there. And they give you some guidance as you make your way from goal A to goal B to goal C. And further, if you were to seek happiness at every step along the pathway of life, not only would it be exhausting, but it would not lead to happiness. This is called the happiness paradox. To be seeking maximum happiness at all times leads to unhappiness. John Stuart Mill put it this way: ask yourself whether you are happy, and you cease to be so. Well, let's move on to the third issue. How are we qualified, define and understand happiness and well-being? This is an aspect of what we were looking at under value, but here it's important of what we're going to include in our evaluating process. Bentham says pleasure, that's pain and happiness. Pleasure and pain. Pain's the intrinsic good, pain is the intrinsic moral evil. Milne says pleasure, which amounts to well-being in his case, and doing away with misery, are intrinsic goals. Well-being is the positive, moral good, misery is the moral evil. But it's such a complex issue for us. Recall that happiness, it derives from many sources. It's a very multi-layered and multifaceted and subjective thing. It involves happiness and desires achieved and relationships and a mass of other things. Well, how is it possible then to qualify and evaluate well-being? Well, the best assertions, I think, and I think these are well stated in the textbook, is simply to say that there are some outcomes which are better and more valuable than others, even if there's no precise measurement of value. There's a sense in which it's common sense. There are some outcomes which are more harmful than others, if there's no precise measurement of the harm. By the way, it is this question of measurement that drives so much discussion today in politics and social theory of statistical analysis and surveys and the like. But there are some things which are just manifestly and clearly better in and of themselves. Well, let's move on to the fourth issue. We talk about a moral community, those to whom we owe the duty. If we owe a duty to minimise pain, if we owe a duty to help others promote well-being, if we need to live in a society where it's our duty to minimise suffering and misery, then who are the members of this community who are deriving the benefits from this? Well, for utilitarians, the moral community consists of all beings who are capable of suffering. That takes us back to Jeremy Bentham's 3 questions. And such people include women and children, and include marginal human beings and animals. Now, some utilitarians disagree about marginal human beings and animals, but most would include marginal human beings. The Tao, Sheffield Tao, gives us a little summation here of his argument about marginal human beings and animals. And let's just state it so you can hear it. If it's immoral to kill and eat marginal human beings and to painfully experiment on them, then it's immoral to treat non-human animals this way. That the contrast here is marginal human beings and non-human animals. It is almost always immoral to kill and eat marginal human beings and to painfully experiment on them. Therefore, it's almost always immoral to kill and eat animals and to painfully experiment on them. I've made a brief comment on this before, I think. Leave this for yourself. Bottom line is anyone capable of suffering? We move on from there. It is this concept of suffering and well-being that help define justice, at least give an approach to understanding justice. When consequentialism seeks to make moral evaluations in an individual person's world, the standard is their maximum well-being. But when the seek to make a moral evaluation in the world outside the individual, in the community, it's the well-being of the world and lack of misery. But this raises a question which seems to haunt utilitarianism. Is justice an intrinsic good? But the consequentialists would insist emphatically, no, the only good is an action which increases the overall well-being of the world. However, a just action ought to produce well-being, they would suggest, but it's the outcome that increases well-being that is good. Justice is not the moral good, being a means to the moral good. And we'll come back to this last observation about justice. In other words, at this point, justice simply is a combination of well-being on the one hand and lack of misery on the other. It is an expression of the experience of justice. Now I'm going to We've already seen G. Moore's comments above on this, and we'll see some more in a moment. Let's pause first to talk about some of the attractions. They're very straightforward. I think you don't have much time on this, nor do I. With you provides both personal and social ethic, gives impartiality, everyone's interest counts equally. It justifies some conventional moral wisdom. It provides for conflict resolution in some cases, and in some cases gives moral flexibility. But there are some challenges to it. First and foremost, it's very demanding. As we saw in the path of life, or thinking of life as a journey, if you're going to deliberate and make judgments about balancing the well-being versus misery at every step of life, it's just plain exhausting. And there's a danger of asserting that the morality of an action depends entirely on its consequences. If that is the case, no action is intrinsically wrong. It's the outcome that may be intrinsically right or wrong. And any action can be justified as being right in the circumstances. Even killing innocent people. In other words, if killing innocent people produces a net balance of moral well-being of a society, then that's what you do. Look at Plato's justification for eugenics in the Republic. That's a concept that's been used time and time again, which is basically it's better for society to kill marginal people. There's another danger, which is very significant, I think, the danger of making acts of supererogation a duty. It's an act that, such an act as one that's performed voluntarily and it goes above and beyond anything you could say is duty. For example, when a volunteer rushes to assist a drowning swimmer, that's considered to be a voluntary act which is done heroically to save someone, and it's done voluntarily, and it's an act of supererogation, and we praise it. But according to the unity principle, if you save the drowning swimmer, you would increase the well-being of the swimmer and the world. And if that's the case, you have a moral duty to rescue them, regardless of the dangers. And of course, then there's the balance of justice and injustice. As we noted in our discussion of T.M. Scanlon's World Cup coverage, balancing the amount of well-being in the world is quite a challenge. It seems to produce a moral duty to leave Joe suffering. This ought to give a significant pause. As morality tend to see we want to save Joe. And too bad about the breaking coverage of the World Cup. There are those who have suggested that this balancing justice and injustice requires a modification of the utilitarian theory to assert that justice and well-being are both intrinsic goods. And that it might appear, particularly in Joe's case, that justice tips the balance in favour of Joe would be the case. Well, I'll leave you with those thoughts. Let's close by looking at what you need to know from this course, or this particular unit. Be aware of the background factors impacting consequentialism. Be aware of the normative moral theories. Be aware of the key contributors to the development of consequentialism and utilitarianism, Bentham and Mill. Be aware of the definitions of consequentialism and the major types of utilitarianism. And in relation to utilitarianism, be able to explain value theory, the theory of right actions, quantifying and evaluating happiness and well-being, who are the subjects, the unity of happiness, how to define justice, and be able to explain the attractions of utilitarianism and the challenges of utilitarianism. Well, thank you for watching, and I wish you the very best for the course.